Ladies and gentlemen, today I speak to you about something that touches every human being: love and hate. At first glance, these emotions seem like opposites. One nurtures, the other destroys. One embraces, the other pushes away. But in truth, love and hate are not separate. They are deeply intertwined, bound together like light and shadow. We often hate most intensely not what is foreign to us, but what is close, familiar, and once loved. Why? Because the emotional energy that fuels love is the same that can turn into hate when trust is broken or expectations collapse. The pain of betrayal comes not from a stranger's actions, but from those we once held dear. We are taught to perceive love and hate as diametrically opposed forces, like light and darkness, or peace and war. But when we closely examine our emotional experiences, we find that the lines between love and hate are far more blurred than we might expect. Both emotions are deeply passionate and arise from a place of emotional investment. Unlike indifference, which carries no emotional weight, both love and hate are expressions of deep concern, attachment, and inner turmoil. They erupt when we care intensely, when something or someone matters profoundly to us. In this way, they are not as different as we might assume. The human heart does not compartmentalize emotions as neatly as our minds do. One can love a person deeply and still harbor feelings of resentment, anger, or even hatred when hurt or betrayed. These feelings can coexist, weaving in and out of one another, changing in intensity depending on our experiences and perceptions. The love we once felt does not simply vanish when someone disappoints us. Instead, it often morphs into something equally passionate but darker. This emotional transformation happens not because love disappears, but because its expression shifts into another emotional language: hatred, still powered by the same source of energy, care, and connection. It's also worth noting that both love and hate involve vulnerability. To love is to open one's soul, to expose oneself emotionally, to invest trust and hope in someone else. Similarly, hate often arises when that vulnerability is wounded, when the trust is broken or the connection is severed painfully. We rarely hate people who are irrelevant to us. We reserve that powerful reaction for those who, at one point, had the capacity to touch our lives deeply. The roots of hate, therefore, are nourished by the same emotional soil as love. They draw strength from shared memories, former affections, and unresolved emotional tension. Understanding the interconnectedness of love and hate helps us to reflect on our emotional responses more wisely. When we feel hatred swelling within us, it often masks deeper emotions: sorrow, longing, disappointment, and above all, love that has not found a healthy outlet. Recognizing this duality allows us to better navigate our relationships, acknowledge our emotional complexity, and reflect on how our past attachments continue to shape our current reaction. By seeing love and hate as parts of a larger emotional spectrum, we gain clarity about the forces that influence our behavior and our bonds with others. The most profound hatreds often emerge from the ashes of the deepest loves. by someone we deeply care about, hurts us, offensive, regaling, precisely because we dwell in the root of result, because we dwell in the illness of result. Such that disbelief, the bitterness, anger, and resentment that follow are not signs that love never existed. On the contrary, they are testaments to just how much emotional energy was once invested. Hate, in these cases, becomes the distorted echo of a love that still lingers in the background, unresolved and repressed. In family ties, this emotional complexity is perhaps even more evident. Children who feel abandoned by a parent, siblings locked in rivalry, or spouses burdened by years of unmet needs often express hatred in moments of conflict. But when one examines the core of these situations, the hate is almost always built upon unmet desires for affection, recognition, support, or care. If those emotions were never there to begin with, the intensity of the response would not exist. The magnitude of the hatred reveals that the person once held or still holds immense emotional value. Without love as a starting point, the pathway to hate would be weak, if not non-existent. This intensity is a signal, not a conclusion. It reflects that something precious was lost, damaged, or threatened. People may lash out, speak cruel words, or seek revenge, not because they never loved, but because they are overwhelmed by the pain of love's absence or betrayal. The fierceness of hate is often a cry for acknowledgement or justice, rooted in the hope that something valuable could have been different. It reveals our longing for emotional fulfillment, our frustration with disappointment, and our inability to completely detach from someone who once made us feel seen, understood, or safe. We rarely experience such extremes of emotion with strangers or casual acquaintances. A co-worker may irritate us, or a stranger may offend us, but those instances rarely generate hatred because the emotional stakes are low. In contrast, the people we once loved possess the power to shape us, shake us, and hurt us at our core. When they fall short of our expectations or break the bonds we cherished, the intensity of our reaction can be volcanic. That intensity, however painful, is evidence of love's lingering shadow. Even in hatred, the trace of love remains, reminding us that the emotional investment was real, raw, and once deeply meaningful. When we enter into relationships, be they romantic, familial, or platonic, we do so with a certain level of trust and emotional openness. That vulnerability is what allows love to grow. We believe the other person will protect our feelings, honor our presence in their life, and reciprocate our emotional investment. However, when that sacred trust is broken through lies, infidelity, abandonment, or consistent neglect, the emotional foundation that once supported love begins to crack. The resulting disappointment doesn't merely dissolve love. More often, it distorts it, turning it into something unrecognizable, something destructive. In this emotional aftermath, love often shifts into hatred, driven by the feeling of betrayal and the sense of emotional injury. Betrayal cuts deeper than most wounds because it defies the expectations that love creates. When we love someone, we build them into our identity, attach hopes and dreams to their presence, and emotionally rely on their steadiness. So, when they act in a way that undermines the trust, it feels like a personal collapse. We don't just lose the person, we lose a piece of ourselves that existed in connection to them. That emotional loss is rarely processed with calm detachment. Instead, it erupts in rage, confusion, or bitterness. All expressions of pain trying to make sense of the sudden collapse of emotional certainty. Hate, in this context, becomes a shield and a reaction, a way to cope with the void that betrayal creates. This transformation reveals how reactive and fragile our emotional landscape can be. Emotions are dynamic and highly susceptible to external actions. The very person who once made you feel whole and alive can, in the span of a moment, become the source of your greatest despair and anger. The speed and intensity with which love turns to hate after betrayal shows how emotions are not isolated states, but connected through a delicate web of expectations and trust. The more we have invested in someone emotionally, the more volatile our reaction becomes when that investment is threatened or dismissed. Hate doesn't arise in a vacuum. It is the result of love being weaponized by disappointment. It is important to recognize that the transformation from love to hate does not imply that love was false or weak. On the contrary, it often points to how deep and sincere that love once was. Now, if betrayal had come from someone insignificant, the emotional upheaval wouldn't be so severe. The pain reaches a profound emotional depth, the emotional significance. That pain, unresolved, channels itself into hatred. Not because we stopped loving them, but because the remnants of that love still live on, twisted by hurt. In this way, hate can be seen as a love that's been wounded and warped, revealing how delicate and easily shaken the human heart truly is. When people speak of opposites, it's easy to fall into the trap of binaries: love versus hate, good versus bad, light versus dark. But when it comes to emotions, the psychology of the human heart is far more nuanced. Many people believe that hate is the opposite of love simply because it feels so extreme and hostile. Yet hate still holds energy, attention, and emotional connection. It still ties you to the person or thing you claim to despise. It is a reaction that in its intensity still honors the emotional significance of the subject. Indifference, by contrast, is marked by the absence of all feeling. It is cold, detached, and emotionally silent. That is what makes it the true counterforce to love. Love is inherently active. It involves caring, hoping, nurturing, and giving. Even when it is painful, it draws you closer emotionally. Hate, too, is active. Raging, accusing, remembering, blaming. It may be damaging and hurtful, but it still implies that something or someone matters. Indifference, on the other hand, signals that nothing remains. There is no engagement, no longing, no emotional pull. Only a void where connection once lived. Indifference says, "You no longer matter to me." And that message is often more devastating than the harshest words uttered in hate. It closes the door entirely on emotional reciprocity or healing. And then you have to find, this is why people often say that being ignored feels worse than being hated. In hate, there is still a dialogue, even if it is dysfunctional and hurtful. Indifference, however, shuts that conversation down. It suggests that the person has been emotionally erased, no longer worth any feeling at all. When someone you once loved becomes indifferent to your existence, it creates a deeper kind of pain, the pain of complete disconnection. Unlike hate, which can be fueled by memory and passion, indifference is powered by disinterest and finality. It is not born of emotion, but of emotional absence, which can leave a person feeling invisible and invalidated. Understanding this distinction between hate and indifference allows us to reflect more clearly on our relationships and emotional responses. When we feel hatred towards someone, it means they still occupy space in our minds and hearts, even if negatively. But when we feel nothing at all, no concern, no pain, no reaction, it means that emotional connection has truly died. That's why hate often signals an unresolved bond, while indifference signifies its burial. In many cases, the journey from love to hate is still part of the emotional process, whereas indifference marks the end of emotional relevance altogether. This understanding is crucial when trying to discern the state of our heart and how we process loss, betrayal, and emotional detachment. Hate is rarely a standalone emotion. It is often a mask for pain. It conceals wounds we have not fully acknowledged. Expansively turned into twist. It is rarely a standard on mind. And the experiential drifts already absorbed. Understanding hate requires emotional excavation. It calls us to dig into our past experiences, memories, and unmet emotional needs to locate the origin of our bitterness. Only then can we understand what our hate is truly trying to communicate. Many people hate not because they never loved, but because their love was not returned in the way they needed or expected. Expectations play a huge role in emotional attachment. We expect people we love to protect us, be loyal, and make us feel valued. When those expectations are broken, especially without closure or understanding, the disappointment festers and transforms. If left unexamined, it evolves into resentment, then frustration, and ultimately into hate. But that hate is merely the external layer. Beneath it lies the original wound, the pain of abandonment, rejection, or emotional betrayal. That pain is often too vulnerable to face directly, so hate becomes a protective shield, hard, loud, and fiercely alive. In many cases, people do not recognize how much they are still hurting until they begin to explore the source of their hatred. A person may claim to despise someone who hurt them years ago, but still dream about that person, stalk their social media, or replay conversations in their head. These lingering emotional threads are not signs of hatred alone. If we are willing to trace the emotional timeline back to where the shift happened, from love to disappointment to rage, we begin to see how hate functions more as a reaction than a destination. It becomes clearer that we are not merely angry, we are wounded and grieving. This process of tracing hate back to its origin is not easy. It requires honesty, vulnerability, and often confronting parts of ourselves we would rather avoid. But in doing so, we give ourselves the opportunity to break the cycle of emotional repression and bitterness. We begin to see hate not as a permanent state, but as a signal pointing towards something that needs healing. When we uncover the original hurt, we may not immediately find forgiveness, but we do begin to understand. And understanding is the first step in reclaiming our emotional well-being from the grip of unresolved pain. I think crime renal is baloney, an afterwell, and after him. And emotional healing is a deeply personal journey, one that begins not by suppressing or denying difficult emotions, but by understanding them. When we recognize that love and hate share the same emotional root, attachment, vulnerability, and care, we begin to see our emotional wounds through a new lens. We no longer view hate as an isolated force, but as a distorted reflection of a love that was once pure and meaningful. This realization helps dissolve the illusion that we are simply angry or bitter. Instead, we begin to uncover the truth that we are carrying the remnants of unprocessed affection, and that our hatred is often a cry for recognition, validation, or closure. The moment we see this emotional duality, we gain the clarity needed to start healing. Rather than allowing hate to define us or poison our view of others, we can start to ask deeper questions. What was I truly hoping for? What part of me was hurt? What did I lose when that relationship broke down? These reflections aren't just philosophical, they are essential acts of self-awareness. By tracing our hate back to the love and expectations that once fueled it, we begin to unravel the tightly wound threads of emotional confusion. This does not mean we condone the hurt or betrayal we experienced, but it does mean we allow ourselves the space to grow from it instead of being consumed by it. Forgiveness in this context becomes possible, not as a gesture to absolve someone else, but as a gift to ourselves. It's the act of releasing emotional chains that have held us in a cycle of pain and resentment. Forgiveness doesn't always mean reconciliation, nor does it imply forgetting the harm done. It means acknowledging that clinging to hatred only perpetuates our suffering, and that choosing to let go is a powerful step toward emotional freedom. Recognizing the shared emotional origin of love and hate helps us understand that these feelings are not enemies, but siblings, both born from connection, longing, and vulnerability. That understanding can soften our stance and open the heart to possibilities beyond bitterness. Letting go is not a sign of weakness, but of strength and emotional maturity. It allows us to move forward without denying what we've been through. When we accept that our hate was rooted in something once meaningful, we no longer feel ashamed of our feelings. We embrace them as part of the healing process. This mindset opens the door to growth, resilience, and inner peace. It teaches us that the same energy once used to fuel hatred can now be redirected towards self-compassion, reflection, and ultimately liberation. Only by confronting the emotional complexity of love and hate can we truly begin the process of release and renewal. Emotional maturity is not about avoiding intense emotions, but about understanding and managing them with self-awareness and depth. When we begin to acknowledge that love and hate are not opposing extremes, but emotional twins born from the same source, we develop a greater capacity to reflect rather than react. This evenness allows us to see our emotional responses not as failures or flaws, but as indicators of deeper truths within us. It teaches us that we are complex beings, capable of feeling contradictory emotions at once, and that there is no shame in that. Accepting this emotional complexity is a sign of inner growth and the first step toward cultivating wisdom. When we fail to recognize the shared roots of love and hate, we often get trapped in cycles of blame, bitterness, and defensiveness. But with emotional maturity comes the ability to pause, examine our feelings, and ask ourselves what lies beneath them. This process allows us to move beyond surface-level reactions and begin identifying what we truly need, whether it's healing, closure, understanding, or self-care. Hate, in this light, becomes not a destination, but a message. It signals an unresolved issue or unmet need. By listening to that message, instead of silencing it, we transform the emotion from something toxic into something enlightening. Moreover, emotional maturity fosters empathy. When we understand that others, like us, may be reacting out of pain, broken trust, or lost love, we soften our judgments. We begin to see that hatred expressed by someone else may not be an expression of evil, but of hurt that they have not yet learned how to process. This shift in perspective allows us to interact with others from a place of compassion rather than retaliation. It does not mean tolerating abuse or excusing harmful behavior, but it does mean recognizing the humanity behind emotional reactions. That recognition enables healthier boundaries, clearer communication, and more emotionally intelligent relationships. Finally, this emotional insight can be transformed into a quiet inner wisdom, one that does not need to shout, fight, or run. Wisdom accepts the coexistence of light and dark within us and others. It knows that love and hate, while emotionally volatile, are rooted in our desire for connection, safety, and meaning. This understanding changes the way we interpret past experiences, making us more mindful in our present relationships. Instead of being ruled by emotional extremes, we learn to hold space for contradiction, to reflect before reacting, and to channel emotional intensity into something constructive. In doing so, we not only heal ourselves, we become capable of guiding others toward the same path of inner clarity and peace. In recognizing that love and hate are not enemies, but reflections of each other, we step into a more honest and human understanding of ourselves. We are no longer afraid of our contradictions, but instead we learn from them. We see that emotions are not fixed. They evolve, transform, and teach us when we choose to listen. By tracing the roots of our hate back to the love that once existed, we give ourselves the opportunity to process, to grow, and to free our hearts from the grip of unresolved pain. This is not weakness. It is emotional strength. It is the courage to feel, to reflect, and ultimately to rise above. For in the heart's deepest chaos lies the potential for its greatest clarity.